Albert Wesker. He's one of those villains that you just can't help but love. Despite the fact that he looks like a sorry rejection from one of the worst of the Matrix films, you can't help but admit that he does exude style. Doesn't help the fact that he has a voice like none other when it comes to villains, exuding the right amount of passion and also poor acting to work. You can thank DC Douglas for that. All this said, it's hard to remember that the man is actually a monster. Whether he's casually killing off his friends and colleagues or declaring himself a bona fide god, Albert Wesker is not a man to be trusted. It's astounding the amount of casual horrors he's committed in his long tenure as Resident Evil's #1 bad guy. And without spoiling too much, let's just say he doesn't exactly get better as the series goes on. So what better way to celebrate one of gaming's all-time greatest villains than by listing all of the things that in real life would make him public enemy #1. I am the resident Resi nerd of WhatCulture Gaming, that is Kirsten, and these are 10 of the most disturbing things that Wesker has ever done. Number 10. Instrumental in BOW creation. Before any of the series even started, Wesker had been up to his fair share of mischief. If by mischief you mean the breaking of several international laws in bioweaponry. Yes, before he was the kung fu super-powered man that we all know and love, Wesker was just a simple scientist for the Umbrella Corporation. He was still a man of extreme genius and questionable morals, however, as he undoubtedly had his hands in the creation of most, if not all, of the experiments and BOWs found in the Spencer Mansion. The ramifications of this are absurd, as almost every virus that appears thereafter was some strain or form of Wesker's original work. Perhaps it would be fair to call Wesker one of the founding fathers of the entire zombie race by the end of the series. Worse than that, it's not even like he stopped when he became the series' primary antagonist. He still continued to work as hard as he could to create new strains and deadly alterations of the tried and true formula that eventually became UROBOROS. And we all know how that turned out. Number 9. Led stars into the mansion. Way back in the annals of history, the original Resident Evil first hit the scene. It was a game that defined the survival horror genre for the next few decades and gave us our first glimpse at Albert Wesker. Leading the members of the Special Task Force STARS on a romp through some awful live-action chase scenes, Wesker brought the group to Spencer Mansion under the guise of a police force assignment. Then he proceeded to double-cross them all in the name of science. And evil, of course. From there, Wesker proceeds on his merry way, doing whatever he can to fool the STARS team members as they probe deeper and deeper into the mansion itself. He even goes so far as to kidnap and lock up whichever playable character the player didn't choose at the start of the game, so Chris or Jill, for daring to oppose his plans. The rest of the game he spends off camera preparing one of the first ever tyrant type zombies. If you don't know what that is, just think of a normal zombie, only 10 foot tall and equipped with as many sharp objects as you can. And then, give it Wolverine's healing factor. Number 8. Injected himself with the T-virus. Wesker may have been present throughout most of Resident Evil 1 and might have even been the driving force for the entire plot, but it wasn't until the end of the game that he officially became the series' villain. Just before revealing his true nature and how he was behind everything all along in the original Resident Evil, Wesker had injected himself with a mutant strain of the T-virus. It was a smart decision too, as not moments later he was rammed through the stomach by the Tyrant, a pretty fatal blow. However, in a stroke of narrative-enhanced luck, Wesker wakes up shortly after the STARS members have defeated the Tyrant, and the huge hole in his stomach seems to have seemingly healed. Not only that, but apparently he also has a super speed, strength and glowing red eyes for some reason. Regardless of the benefits, this marks the first step Wesker takes in throwing away his humanity, becoming almost as bad as the rest of the monsters Umbrella spews out. At least he managed to keep his looks, and those sweet sunglasses, they actually have a purpose now. Number 7. Brainwashed Jill. Early on in Resident Evil 5, resident meathead and steroids enthusiast Chris Redfield explains how he ended up without his iconic partner, Jill Valentine, and fans were obviously upset. Such a pillar of the franchise being killed off in such an unceremonious way is akin to heresy in the eyes of the fanbase. But of course she died off screen, and as everybody who is up to date with Stranger Things knows, that means she isn't actually dead. The reality is even worse though. She's blonde now. Putting aside the fanbase hatred of what hair dye our character uses, Wesker reveals that not only has he brainwashed Jill to be his servant, he has also done so in perhaps one of the most intrusive and frankly disgusting ways possible. In a move that could only have been done so the developers had a chance to have Jill undo her skin-tight suit, Wesker made it so that the brainwashing in question was located entirely on the heroine's chest. Cue a rather fun boss fight that ends in one of the most awkward chest-grabbing button mashers of all time. Number 6. Infected EXCELLA GIONNE. She was just as much of a narcissistic bioterrorist as Wesker was, but she did it all out of a misguided sense of love. Or lust, it's never really clear, actually. So when Wesker ultimately betrays his queen and infects her with a virus she'd spent so long creating with him, well, it doesn't even come as that much of a shock knowing Wesker by this point. It's a moment for the player to realise, however, just how expendable everybody in Wesker's life is when compared to the completion of his plans. Rather than save the woman, or simpler still, do absolutely nothing to her, he decides to instead doom her to a fate worse than death for no reason, especially since he knows he can take on Chris and Sheva quite fine on his own. It's not like he needs them to have another boss fight, but still she transforms as they all do, and takes up an entire boss fight slot in the process, all because Wesker couldn't really be bothered to have her around anymore. What a lovely boyfriend he is. Number 5. Complete global saturation. When Chris and Sheva finally catch up to Wesker and face off in one of the most grueling Matrix-style boss fights since 2003, he escapes in a plane with the two heroes following hot on his heels. In the air, Wesker reveals his plans to release the virus UROBOROS into the atmosphere, and with it he delivers this iconic line.
Ouroboros will be released into the atmosphere, ensuring complete global saturation.
His entire plan at this point is to just fly around the world and fire missiles loaded with the virus directly into heavily populated areas, either allowing the infected individuals to suffer and die or ascend to his own level. It's here that the player gets a good look at just how loony Wesker has become, declaring himself to be a veritable god as he monologues in the way only he and Bond villains seem to be capable of without it seeming cheesy. In the end, his plans are foiled by a man with more muscles than brains and a sidekick who may or may not be wearing a leopard print bikini, depending on the player's preferences. But of course, it's not over. Number 4 injected himself again with Ouroboros. What is it with Resident Evil villains and their overwhelming desire to become a mass of tentacles and goo? It's almost like every single game seems to have some sort of finale where a desperate individual decides that the only way that they can win is by becoming some sort of HP Lovecraftian monster, and not one of the good ones either. Wesker is probably the worst offender, however, as he injects himself not once, but twice in the span of a couple of years, as if he wasn't already a superpowered madman. The result is a flailing mass of tentacles, as expected, and some of the most infuriating screeching of the name Chris that has ever been committed to audio form. It is at this moment that Wesker truly lost it. Instead of acting like the god he proclaims himself to be, he became just like the rest of his experiments and monsters. From there, it's all an example of classic Resident Evil affair. There's a fight in a volcano, Steroids Man punches a boulder into lava, and the good guys win with good old-fashioned American explosions. Number 3, survived the volcano. A good villain just doesn't know when to quit, and that seems to be the case for Wesker too. Even though he was literally exploded inside of a volcano, there are still some clues out there as to the madman's continued survival. In a game that nobody played, and if you did, I hope you're doing okay, spin-off Umbrella Corps featured some of the least engaging multiplayer content ever seen in the series, and that's really saying something. However, through a series of notes and logs on something called the Experiment, it is revealed that there's someone familiar higher up the chain of command, a man who talks as if he was involved in the events of the past, and someone who terrifies absolutely everybody in the newly reformed Umbrella. Sound familiar? If that isn't enough to convince you, then sometimes after performing particularly well in a mission, a voice will chime in and say, "That was satisfactory," in those beautiful dulcet tones that only DC Douglas could pull off so well. But ever since Resident Evil 7 and the new direction of the remakes, it's difficult to say whether Wesker belongs in the new canon. I mean, if a volcano doesn't do the job, then what can? Number 2, father to Jake Muller. There was a time when Resident Evil was just about normal people with guns trying to fight off whatever new alphabetized virus came their way. Now, however, you would be hard-pressed to find a single person in the franchise that doesn't make Jason Bourne and James Bond combined look like absolute amateurs. The only thing worse would be if somehow one of these protagonists managed to have actual superpowers, but that would never happen, right? A character who can run through the entire game punching and kicking the most deadly of bioweapons into oblivion is no fun to play as at all in a game like this. It works so well for Wesker because he's the villain, an insurmountable force that is more of a monster than a man by the time he's reached the height of his power. So in spawning him, Wesker had performed the single most disturbing feat he had ever accomplished. He basically helped make Resident Evil 6, and whilst Jake isn't the worst thing in the game, Chris the alcoholic says hello, we certainly could have done without him. Number 1, all of Resident Evil. By this point, it should be clear that Albert Wesker is not a good man, so when we examine the entire series as a whole, it becomes clear very fast that almost everything seems to trace back to him. Responsible for everything that ever happened in Resident Evil is no small feat, especially when he isn't even around for some of the game's actual plotlines. Hell, he even has a small part to play in Resident Evil 7, and by then the man is supposedly long dead. Regarded as one of the all-time greatest video game villains for all his accomplishments is something the man truly deserves at this point. And so for all of his scheming, betrayals and self-medicated injections based purely on thinking he's badass enough to take them, Wesker has proved time and time again throughout the franchise that he was in control. So let's just hope that his tyranny is finally at an end, safe with the knowledge that even a god can be killed by an active volcano and a couple of high-powered explosives. Hopefully. And that's our list. I hope you enjoyed my first ever face-to-cam video. I know I did. If you did, give it a like, and if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button down there. But for now, I've been Kirsten from WhatCulture, and I'll see you in the next one.